To read well is to take great risks. It is to make vulnerable our identity, our self-possession. In the early stages of epilepsy, there occurs a characteristic dream. Dostoevsky tells of it. One is somehow lifted free of one's own body. Looking back, one sees oneself and feels a sudden, maddening fear. Another presence is entering into one's own person, and there is no avenue of return. Feeling this fear, the mind gropes to a sharp awakening. So it should be when we take in hand a major work of literature or philosophy, of imagination or doctrine, it may come to possess us so completely that we go, for a spell, in fear of ourselves and in imperfect recognition. He who has read Kafka's Metamorphosis and can look into his mirror unflinching may technically be able to read print, but is illiterate in the only sense that matters.
Would you still love me if I was a worm? This is a popular question, often directed to loved ones, obviously meant in jest, but behind the joke lies a deep-seated insecurity. Would the people we love continue to love us back under different circumstances? Or is the love that we experience merely a product of happenstance? There is a certain universality to the sentiment expressed through it, and turns out this question has troubled humanity for longer than we realize. In 1915, Franz Kafka attempted to answer this question through his famous short story, The Metamorphosis. In 2003, the award-winning Japanese author Urobuchi Gen offered his own twist by writing the light novel The Song of Saya. Whenever The Song of Saya is brought up, discussions almost exclusively involve how messed up it supposedly is. People either praise it or condemn it for the shock value of its disturbing content, but rarely say anything more substantial, and I consider that a shame. I think the reason people are reluctant to engage with the material is because The Song of Saya tackles many topics that are generally considered taboo, especially in Western society. This manifests as a chilling effect in two ways. People who feel moral discomfort when consuming a work of art often lash out against the author, the art itself, or its audience as an avoidance strategy to prevent themselves from confronting their own emotions, while people who do enjoy the same work of art may feel reluctant to verbalize their true thoughts for fear of being shunned by the former group. This tendency to pathologize art by using the pretense of taste as a moral or social shield is deeply anti-intellectualist, and unfortunately exists in almost all sides of the political spectrum. People may use different buzzwords, but the underlying cause is the same, as well as the intention. I consider The Song of Saya and The Metamorphosis to be thematically identical in many ways. In fact, when The Metamorphosis was first published, many critics dismissed it for its supposed over-reliance on shock value, similar to how The Song of Saya has been treated. In this video, I'll be doing a comparative analysis, identifying the similarities between the two, and explaining why both stories hold such meaning to me. Needless to say, everything I say here is simply my opinion, based on my personal interpretations of the works mentioned. So first, let's talk about The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka.
Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand er sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt.
The Metamorphosis was published in 1915 and tells the story of Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning from his restless sleep only to realize that he has been somehow transformed into a monstrous vermin. The original text uses the term ungeheures Ungeziefer, which is an intentionally vague term to refer to an unclean pest. Many people imagine a giant bug or cockroach, but Kafka never specified what Gregor Samsa was transformed into. In fact, Kafka was categorically opposed to having any illustrations of Gregor's likeness in the publications of his story. In my view, what makes The Metamorphosis so powerful is that, despite being a relatively simplistic and seemingly silly story, it has a surprising amount of depth and can be interpreted in many different ways. Is it about capitalism and how people are valued only for their labor? Is it about Marxist alienation? Is it about middle-class anxiety? Is it about 20th century masculinity, the expectation of men to be providers and how their failure to do so unsexes them? Is it about misandry and how men tend to be perceived as predatory monsters based on prejudice? Is it about the patriarchy and the rivalry between father and son over the ownership of women? Is it about ableism and how disabled people are treated as a burden? Is it about how abuse victims are often made to feel as though they are the perpetrators? Is it about the inherent impermanence of existence? Is it about the realization that the self is not a continuum? Is it about Kafka himself? Is it about the Great War and how he felt like a parasite for not fighting in it? Is it about his relationship with his abusive father? Is it about his neurodivergence? Yes, all of these interpretations are quite valid, and many scholars before me have discussed these topics quite extensively. What I want to focus on in this video is something that is not as commonly talked about. Gregor Samsa's sexual alienation, and how it reflected Kafka's own insecurities with physical intimacy. So, Gregor wakes up one morning from uneasy dreams and finds himself transformed into this ineffable, vile entity.
What's happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Samsa was a travelling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared.
As he lays in bed, shocked by this new reality, the very first thing Gregor looks at after waking up and realizing he has been turned into this monstrous entity is the woman in furs. The picture is mentioned in passing as a seemingly unimportant detail, but it gains significance much later in the story. At first, Gregor is in denial, thinking that if only he went back to sleep, this would go away. But his new body is stiff and cumbersome, and he doesn't know how to use it, so he can't make himself comfortable enough to go back to sleep. Any movement he tries to make is difficult and unpleasant. His body feels dysmorphic to his own sensations. The first coherent thought Gregor has is about his job. He is a traveling salesman who despises his job, because all human exchanges are ephemeral and superficial, but he needs it to pay off his retired father's debts. Gregor is worried that he might get fired if he doesn't show up for work. Even if he called in sick, his boss would probably still show up to check if he was lying, even though Gregor has never missed work before. Just as Gregor feared, his boss is soon knocking on the front door. Gregor lives with his family, so they open the door for him, and a few seconds later, his parents, his sister, and his boss are banging on his bedroom door, asking him to open it. Gregor tries to stall, but realizes that he can no longer speak in a human language. The words that come out of Gregor's mouth sound normal to him, but unintelligible to everyone else. Having run out of options, Gregor opens his bedroom door, and everyone is instantly horrified by the sight of him. His boss runs away in panic, and his father violently shoves Gregor back into his room, injuring him in the process. In his very first interaction with other people after his transformation, Gregor is met with fear, hostility, and disgust. This extreme sense of social rejection is punctuated by the reaction of the servant girl employed by the Samsa family, who begs to be fired.
In addition, on the very first day, the servant girl, it was not completely clear what and how much she knew about what had happened, on her knees had begged his mother to let her go immediately, and when she said goodbye about 15 minutes later, she thanked them for the dismissal with tears in her eyes, as if she was receiving the greatest favour which people had shown her there, and, without anyone demanding it from her, she swore a fearful oath not to betray anyone, not even the slightest bit.
Soon, a new daily routine is born for the Samsa family. Gregor is forced to stay permanently locked in his room, while his younger sister Greta becomes his caregiver by bringing him food and doing housework for him. She's the only one who interacts with him. Gregor notices that Greta avoids touching the plates of food she brings with her bare hands. She uses a piece of cloth to hold them, and always throws any leftovers away afterwards, regardless of whether Gregor touched them. Gregor also notices that the first thing Greta does every time she enters his room is to go directly to the window and open it, as if the room accumulates a foul smell she needs to air out before she can continue. Greta also quickly closes the door behind her whenever she enters the room, presumably to spare anyone else in the family the displeasure of accidentally seeing Gregor. Gregor soon realizes that foods he used to enjoy no longer taste as good as he remembers. He prefers rotten food now. In fact, all of Gregor's senses are different. His eyesight, his sense of smell are slowly changing. Greta notices his new preferences and starts bringing him garbage to eat, leftover bones from the family's dinner, spoiled vegetables, anything not suitable for human consumption is given to Gregor. Gregor also notices that despite her kindness, Greta continues to be afraid and disgusted by his appearance, so he dutifully hides himself away, behind or under furniture whenever she enters his room to do housework. Gregor doesn't want even a tiny part of him to be accidentally visible to her and scare her. So one day he decides to spend 4 hours laboriously rearranging the furniture in his room so that he can fully hide his body from her whenever she enters, to spare her from having to see him at all. Greta notices that Gregor seems to enjoy crawling on the walls and ceiling, as evidenced by the slimy residue left behind by his feet. It's true, Gregor has been starting to feel more comfortable in his new body. He enjoys crawling around, he appreciates the functionality of his new body parts, and he recently learned how to fall from the ceiling to the floor without damaging himself. And so, Greta ponders the possibility of removing most of the furniture from Gregor's room so that he would have more space to move freely.
But she was in no position to do this by herself. She did not dare to ask her father to help, and the servant girl would certainly not have assisted her, for although this girl, about 16 years old, had courageously remained since the dismissal of the previous cook, she had begged for the privilege of being allowed to stay permanently confined to the kitchen and of having to open the door only in answer to a special summons. Thus, his sister had no other choice but to involve his mother while his father was absent.
Meanwhile, Mrs. Samsa is in hysterical grief over the plight of Gregor. She repeatedly begs to see her unfortunate son, as she calls him, but never does. Gregor himself doesn't want to be seen by his mother, which he thinks would cause her further distress. After a few weeks, she does enter Gregor's room to see him, but only after Greta has peeked inside and made sure Gregor was well hidden, so she couldn't see him. Gregor listens to his sister tell their mother about her idea of removing the furniture from the room so that Gregor has ample space to enjoy crawling around. Gregor initially likes this idea. However, his mother has a different opinion. She thinks removing the furniture from Gregor's room would be a sign of giving up on Gregor, admitting that he would never return from his current state. Gregor's furniture consists of things he loves, so why should they remove them? Gregor is taken aback by his mother's comments and finds himself agreeing. What possessed him to think that his room would be better without furniture? Why would he give up all of his belongings just so he could crawl around more freely? Gregor is afraid that without his furniture, he will soon forget his own identity and become a mindless creature that crawls around walls. Of course, Gregor has no way of communicating his wishes and doesn't want to scare either his sister or his mother with his appearance, so he remains hidden. Greta disagrees with her mother, and given that she has been Gregor's sole caregiver for a while, she sees herself as an authority on Gregor's wishes, so she insists that the furniture should be removed, except for the couch, so that Gregor has somewhere to hide himself. And so, Gregor's sister and mother start moving the furniture out of his room. Gregor remains hidden, but becomes increasingly upset and agitated from both the act of losing all of his belongings as well as the noise and commotion caused by the physical moving of his furniture. Even though he keeps trying to calm himself, Gregor can't take it anymore and eventually breaks. While the two women are in the next room catching their breaths, Gregor leaps out from his hiding place and starts frantically looking around his half-emptied room for something to save, until his gaze falls upon the framed picture on the wall. The picture of the woman in furs.
And so he scuttled out. The women were just propping themselves up on the writing desk in the next room in order to take a breather, changing the direction of his path 4 times. He really didn't know what he should rescue first. Then he saw, hanging conspicuously on the wall, which was otherwise already empty, the picture of the woman dressed in nothing but fur. He quickly scurried up over it and pressed himself against the glass that held it in place, and which made his hot abdomen feel good. At least this picture, which Gregor at the moment completely concealed, surely no one would now take away. He twisted his head towards the door of the living room to observe the women as they came back in.
Gregor thinks to himself that he will not allow anyone to take that picture. If Greta tries to shoo him away, he will pounce on her. Gregor sits there, staring at the door, waiting for his sister and mother to return, ready to confront them. When the two women walk through the doorway, his mother sees Gregor and faints. Greta is furious at him and angrily yells, "Gregor!" to reprimand him. This is the first time Greta has spoken directly to Gregor since his transformation. Greta runs out of the room to fetch smelling salts to revive her mother. Gregor is instantly remorseful for his actions. He detaches himself from the picture and instinctively runs after Greta to help her, forgetting that he is unable to in his current state. Greta sees Gregor following her, so she runs back to his room and slams the door behind her, locking Gregor outside of his own bedroom. Gregor's father, Mr. Samsa, comes home from work. He has to work now, since Gregor can't. He thinks Gregor has escaped from his room and is attacking the family, so he approaches Gregor aggressively.
"Yes, I have expected that," said his father. "I always told you that, but you women don't want to listen."
Gregor tries to indicate with his body language that he is willing to go back to his room so long as someone opens the door for him. Mr. Samsa is too angry to notice such a thing, and so he lunges at Gregor, trying to stomp him with his enormous work boots. Gregor manages to dodge his attacks multiple times, much to the frustration of his father, who furiously starts throwing apples at him. One of the apples manages to hit Gregor, causing him immense pain. Meanwhile, Greta opens the bedroom door and the mother runs out half naked. Earlier, Greta loosened some of her clothes to help her breathe, and as the mother frantically runs to protect Gregor from his father's rage, her layers of clothing start sliding off, falling onto the floor one by one. Mrs. Samsa falls on his father, pressing her body against his, begging him to spare Gregor.
Only with his final glance did he notice how the door of his room was pulled open, and how right in front of his sister, who was yelling, his mother ran out in her undergarments, for his sister had undressed her in order to give her some freedom to breathe in her fainting spell, and how his mother then ran up to his father, on the way her tied-up skirts, one after the other, slipped toward the floor, and how, tripping over her skirts, she hurled herself onto his father and, throwing her arms around him, in complete union with him. But at this moment Gregor's powers of sight gave way, as her hands reached to the back of his father's head, and she begged him to spare Gregor's life.
During all this commotion, Gregor manages to painfully crawl back into his room. Time passes. The apple that hit Gregor remains lodged in his body, and nobody tries to remove it. It stays there, as a constant reminder of his father's hatred of him. The wound becomes infected, oozing with pus. Soon, Greta and the mother also find employment to financially help the family. Even with the three of them working, they still earn less than what Gregor used to earn as a salesman. Since Greta is busy working, she has less time to take care of Gregor, so his room gradually becomes dirtier. One day, Mrs. Samsa decides to try cleaning Gregor's room.
Once his mother had undertaken a major cleaning of Gregor's room, which she had only completed successfully after using a few buckets of water, but the extensive dampness made Gregor sick and he lay supine, embittered and immobile on the couch. However, the mother's punishment was not delayed for long, for in the evening the sister had hardly observed the change in Gregor's room before she ran into the living room, mightily offended, and, in spite of her mother's hand, lifted high in entreaty, broke out in a fit of crying. Her parents, the father had of course woken up with a start in his armchair, at first looked at her astonished and helpless, until they started to get agitated. Turning to his right, the father heaped reproaches on the mother that she was not to take over the cleaning of Gregor's room from the sister, and turning to his left, he shouted at the sister that she would no longer be allowed to clean Gregor's room ever again, while the mother tried to pull the father, beside himself in his excitement, into the bedroom. The sister, shaken by her crying fit, pounded on the table with her tiny fists, and Gregor hissed at all this, angry that no one thought about shutting the door and sparing him the sight of this commotion.
And so, Greta is no longer Gregor's caregiver. Gregor's room is starting to accumulate more and more dirt, and is being treated like a storage room. The family has also started renting a room to 3 male tenants to supplement its income. Gregor eats less and sleeps less. The Samsa family fires the 16-year-old servant girl and hires an old widow as a charwoman to help take care of the house. The charwoman is the first person to not show any fear or open disgust towards Gregor.
But even when the sister, exhausted from her daily work, had grown tired of caring for Gregor as she had before, Even then the mother did not have to come at all on her behalf, and Gregor did not have to be neglected, for now the cleaning woman was there, this old widow who in her long life must have managed to survive the worst with the help of her bony frame, had no real horror of Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once by chance opened Gregor's door. At the sight of Gregor, who, totally surprised, began to scamper here and there, although no one was chasing him, she remained standing with her hands folded across her stomach staring at him. Since then, she did not fail to open the door furtively a little every morning and evening to look in on Gregor. At first, she also called him to her with words which she presumably thought were friendly, like, "Come here for a bit, old dung beetle," or, "Hey, look at the old dung beetle." Addressed in such a manner, Gregor answered nothing, but remained motionless in his place, as if the door had not been opened at all. If only, instead of allowing this cleaning woman to disturb him uselessly whenever she felt like it, they had instead given her orders to clean up his room every day. One day in the early morning, a hard downpour, perhaps already a sign of the coming spring, struck the window panes. When the cleaning woman started up once again with her usual conversation, Gregor was so bitter that he turned towards her, as if for an attack, although slowly and weakly. But instead of being afraid of him, the cleaning woman merely lifted up a chair, standing close by the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, her intention was clear. She would close her mouth only when the chair in her hand had been thrown down on Gregor's back. "This goes no further, all right?" she asked, as Gregor turned himself around again, and she placed the chair calmly back in the corner.
One evening, the charwoman did not close Gregor's door securely, so Gregor peers through the crack and sees his sister playing the violin in the living room. The three male tenants seem disinterested in the music, but Gregor is captivated by it. He even explicitly thinks, "Am I an animal if music moves me so?" Gregor silently crawls out of his room to get closer to his sister. As he listens to her music, he becomes more and more brazen, walking even closer. He is secretly hoping that she will look in his direction and meet his gaze.
For him it was as if the way to the unknown nourishment he craved was revealing itself to him. He was determined to press forward right to his sister, to tug at her dress, and to indicate to her in this way that she might still come with her violin into his room, because here no one valued the recital as he wanted to value it. He did not wish to let her go from his room anymore, at least not as long as he lived. His frightening appearance would for the first time become useful for him. He wanted to be at all the doors of his room simultaneously and snarl back at the attackers. However, his sister should not be compelled, but would remain with him voluntarily. She would sit next to him on the sofa, bend down her ear to him, and he would then confide in her that he firmly intended to send her to the conservatory, and that, if his misfortune had not arrived in the interim, he would have declared all this last Christmas, had Christmas really already come and gone, and would have brooked no argument. After this explanation, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would lift himself up to her armpit and kiss her throat, which she, from the time she started going to work, had left exposed without a band or a collar.
This fantasy is suddenly interrupted by one of the tenants and is now pointing his finger at him. The violin music stops. Mr. Samsa immediately intervenes, trying to politely lead the tenants away from Gregor, but the tenants seem mildly entertained and curious about Gregor, asking about him. Mr. Samsa is so preoccupied with preventing the tenants from looking at Gregor's disgusting appearance that he forgets about social decorum and shoves them rudely to another room. The tenants become enraged by this insolence and declare that they are leaving and they will not be paying any rent given the unhygienic conditions, and that they will be pursuing legal action against him. Gregor remains frozen in the room, partly due to shock and partly due to his fatigue from not eating or sleeping properly. After the tenants have gone to their room, Greta speaks first. She tells her parents that this can't go on any longer. They must get rid of it. She specifically refers to Gregor as it. She says this twice. The parents agree, but they don't know what to do about it. If only Gregor could understand us, they keep lamenting. If only.
"It has to go," Greta shouted. "You must stop thinking that this is Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have gone of his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother anymore, but we could at least carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. As it is now, this animal is plaguing us. It has driven out our tenants. It obviously wants to take over the whole apartment and force us to the streets."
Upon hearing this, Gregor starts to slowly turn around to go back to his room. Greta notices his movement and screams as if Gregor is trying to attack them. She jumps out of her chair, runs past her mother, and hides behind her father. The entire family stares at him silently with fear and disgust. Gregor slowly crawls back into his room, and as soon as his body has passed the doorway, the door slams behind him and the lock turns. Finally, he hears Greta's voice say. Gregor is now alone in his dark room and wonders, what now? He thinks that he too would like to disappear, wishing it even more than his sister. He stays there, without moving, for hours into the night, in silent rumination, until he finally dies. Gregor's last breath leaves his nostrils. And yes, the text explicitly mentions his nostrils, a final reminder of Gregor's lingering humanity. The next day, his dead body is discovered by the charwoman.
When she quickly realized the true state of affairs, her eyes grew large. She whistled to herself, but didn't restrain herself for long. She pulled open the door of the bedroom and yelled in a loud voice into the darkness, "Come and look! It's kicked the bucket. It's lying there, totally snuffed." The Samsa married couple sat upright in their marriage bed and had to get over their fright at the cleaning woman before they managed to grasp her message. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa climbed very quickly out of bed, one on either side. Mr. Samsa threw the bedspread over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa came out only in her nightshirt, and like this they stepped into Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room, in which Greta had slept since the lodgers had arrived on the scene, had also opened. She was fully clothed, as if she had not slept at all. Her white face also seems to indicate that.
The family seems to genuinely mourn him. Soon the 3 male tenants wake up, appearing to have forgotten about yesterday's fight.
The 3 lodgers stepped out of their room and looked around for their breakfast, astonished that they had been forgotten. "Where is the breakfast?" asked the middle one of the gentlemen grumpily to the cleaning woman. However, she laid her finger to her lips, and then quickly and silently indicated to the lodgers that they could come into Gregor's room. So they came and stood around Gregor's corpse, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat worn jackets, in the room, which was already quite bright. Then the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All were a little tear-stained. Now and then Greta pressed her face onto her father's arm. "Get out of my apartment immediately," said Mr. Samsa, and pulled open the door, without letting go of the women.
In an almost triumphant display of masculinity, Mr. Samsa kicks the 3 male tenants out of the house. The Samsa family decides to take a day off from work, and so they start writing letters to their employers, informing them so. Mr. Samsa is in now full control of the family again.
Mr. Samsa turned around in his chair in their direction and observed them quietly for a while. Then he called out, "All right, come here then. Let's finally get rid of old things, and have a little consideration for me." The women attended to him at once. They rushed to him, caressed him, and quickly ended their letters.
They decide to have a family day out and take the tram to the countryside.
Then all 3 left the apartment together, something they had not done for months now, and took the electric tram into the open air outside the city. The car in which they were sitting by themselves was totally engulfed by the warm sun. They talked to each other, leaning back comfortably in their seats, about future prospects, and they discovered that on closer observation these were not at all bad, for all 3 had employment, about which they had not really questioned each other at all, which was extremely favourable and with especially promising prospects. The greatest improvement in their situation at this moment, of course, had to come from a change of dwelling. Now they wanted to rent an apartment smaller and cheaper, but better situated and generally more practical than the present one, which Gregor had found. While they amused themselves in this way, it struck Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same moment how their daughter, who was getting more animated all the time, had blossomed recently, in spite of all the troubles which had made her cheeks pale, into a beautiful and voluptuous young woman. Growing more silent and almost unconsciously understanding each other in their glances, they thought that the time was now at hand to seek out a good, honest man for her, and it was something of a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when at the end of their journey the daughter first lifted herself up and stretched her young body.
And that is how the story ends. It began with Gregor's transformation into something grotesque and repulsive, and it ends with Greta's transformation into something beautiful and seductive. Throughout the story, there are multiple scenes where Kafka draws attention to details that seem unimportant to the narrative. Why is the woman in furs there? Why a woman in furs and not something else? Why is the servant girl's age of 16 mentioned so explicitly? Why does Kafka keep focusing on what clothes Mrs. Samsa is wearing? In the most climactic scene, where Gregor is wounded by the apple, Mrs. Samsa literally throws herself naked onto Mr. Samsa to protect Gregor from his father's wrath. Gregor's mother saves his life by projecting her sexuality towards Gregor's own abuser. This creates an interesting emotional juxtaposition. On the one hand, it shows Gregor that he is still loved by his mother, but on the other hand, Gregor is sexually humiliated by his father's masculine dominance over him. Gregor is almost killed in a physical confrontation with his father, and then his own mother has to prostitute herself to his father in order to save him. This scene perfectly encapsulates Gregor's sexual impotence, especially in comparison to his father. And let's not forget, all of this happens because Gregor dared to keep the picture of the woman in furs, the symbol of his sexual desire. Gregor came out of hiding to protect the picture. His mother saw him and fainted. Then Gregor was locked out of his room. Then his father came in and saw him outside. The entire sequence of events is traced back to the woman in furs. The very act of Gregor protecting the picture is described as intimate and overly physical. The woman in furs is clearly very important to him. A bourgeois fantasy of idealized beauty and affluence hanging over the items of the job he hated. And after months of mistreatment, Gregor finally musters up the courage to defend his sexuality, only to be ruthlessly dominated by his own father. A similar thing happens later, when Mr. Samsa gets angry and starts yelling at everyone, and Mrs. Samsa's immediate reaction is to take him to the bedroom, all while Gregor is watching. The general shift in the familial power dynamic from Gregor as the provider to Mr. Samsa reclaiming the throne of the patriarch is further reinforced by how Mr. Samsa is described by the narrative. As the story progresses, Mr. Samsa becomes a hyper-masculine figure that towers over Gregor. He is repeatedly portrayed in almost heroic poses, with each arm over the two women, Mrs. Samsa and Greta. So as we can see, Gregor's story can be read as a story of sexual alienation. His sexuality is eclipsed by that of his father's, and remains forever unsatiated, experiencing constant rejection by those around him. Gregor himself is kept locked away in his room, deprived of any form of intimacy, wallowing in shame. Gregor's transformation serves as an allegory of his body dysmorphia. He views himself as a monster because everyone rejects him. The rejection Gregor feels is internalized as self-loathing and self-disgust. Everyone can see what a monster he is. But in reality, there are several characters in the story who are not disgusted by him. The charwoman the family hires to clean the house is not afraid of him. The three tenants view him with casual curiosity. It is the shame that has been imposed onto Gregor by his family that turns him into a monster. His family is trying to hide him, their dirty little secret, which manifests Gregor's monstrous nature. The story is more about how Gregor views himself than how others perceive him. In fact, the entire series of events plays out like a fantasy of Gregor's encroaching depression and suicidality. He sees himself as a disgusting parasite, a burden his family has to put up with. He projects his own self-loathing onto them, predicting that they would be happier if he didn't exist. This hatred Gregor feels for himself, especially in the context of his own sexuality, mirrors Franz Kafka's life quite accurately.
I was afraid of mirrors, for they showed in me an inevitable ugliness.
According to his biographers, Kafka was a very sociable, physically frail man with a high sex drive and a debilitating sense of shame. He frequently met with sex workers and had a large collection of highly eclectic pornography in his home.
Even in cultivated circles, visits to brothels were not considered embarrassing. At a time when the briefest sexual relationship with a social equal threatened to end in an engagement or a scandal, no young, unmarried client had to put himself in that desperate bind. Kafka, whose sense of shame was easy to arouse, thought nothing of visiting brothels in Prague, Milan, and Paris with Max Brod. That was a more stimulating but hardly more reprehensible kind of cheap entertainment than any other.
While Kafka did not seem to be ashamed of visiting sex workers, he did seem to express concern about being unmarried after a certain age.
If I reach my 40th year, then I'll probably marry an old maid with protruding upper teeth left a little exposed by the upper lip. The upper front teeth of Miss K, who was in Paris and London, slant towards each other a little like legs, which are quickly crossed at the knees. I'll hardly reach my 40th birthday, however. The frequent tension over the left half of my skull, for example, speaks against it. It feels like an inner leprosy, which, when I only observe it and disregard its unpleasantness, makes the same impression on me as the skull cross-section in textbooks, or as an almost painless dissection of the living body where the knife, a little coolingly, carefully, often stopping and going back, sometimes lying still, splits still thinner the paper-thin integument close to the functioning parts of the brain.
Kafka's tendency to focus on detailed descriptions of physical features, especially in the context of sexuality, show up repeatedly in his diaries and letters.
As a result, I let the awful clothes affect even my posture, walked around with my back bowed, my shoulders drooping, my hands and arms at awkward angles, was afraid of mirrors, because they showed in me an ugliness which in my opinion was inevitable, which moreover could not have been an entirely truthful reflection, for had I actually looked like that, I certainly would have attracted even more attention, suffered gentle pokes in the back from my mother on Sunday walks, in admonitions and prophecies which were much too abstract for me to be able to relate them to the worries I then had.
Kafka seemed to frequently obsess over tiny imperfections of both himself and other people.
The bursting sexuality of the women, their natural impurity, the flirtation, senseless for me, with little Lena, the sight of a stout woman hunched up in a basket chair, one foot curiously pushed backwards, who was sewing something and talking to an old woman, probably an old spinster, whose teeth appeared unusually large on one side of her mouth, the full-bloodedness and wisdom of the pregnant woman, her behind almost faceted by evenly divided planes, the life on the small terrace, how I coldly took the little girl on my lap, not at all unhappy about the coolness.
Kafka's sexual thoughts tend to be framed in this raw physicality, wrapped in shame and avoidance. The same is true of his desire for intimacy and validation as a whole. A great example of this ambivalence is in one of his letters to Felice Bauer, one of his lovers.
It fills me with horror, Felice, when I imagine that on a lovely morning, after a reasonably good night, you sit at breakfast in anticipation of a pleasant day ahead, and morning after morning you are handed my infernal letters like messages from the underworld. But what can I do, Felice? In your last letters and postcards I get no feeling of your nearness to me, your help, your definite determination, and unless I can be sure of that, I can effect no contact with your parents, since you alone, create my only valid connection with people, and you alone will be the one to create it in future. So I shall have to await your reply to yesterday's letter. Don't you understand my position, Felice? My own suffering is far greater than the suffering I inflict, but this, though it means a great deal, does not in itself exonerate me in any way.
Literally one day after writing this letter, Kafka wrote the following in his diary.
Perhaps everything is now ended and the letter I wrote yesterday was the last one. That would certainly be the best. What I shall suffer, what she will suffer, that cannot be compared with the common suffering that would result. I shall gradually pull myself together. She will marry, that is the only way out among the living. We cannot beat a path into the rock for the two of us. It is enough that we wept and tortured ourselves for a year. She will realize this from my last letters. If not, then I will certainly marry her, for I am too weak to resist her opinion about our common fortune and am unable not to carry out as far as I can, something she considers possible.
Kafka would very often withdraw into these elaborate fantasies of imaginary rejection and catastrophism, his shame and self-loathing projected onto his lovers. There is even an element of black-pilled fatalism. Kafka portrayed himself as a known agent in his own life. Even when expressing his most self-indulgent thoughts, he would immediately restrain himself, as if he was fearful of his own imagination. He would think about sex, but then change the subject, as if afraid of giving in to his sexual desire. This oscillation between sexual indulgence and sexual shame, as well as neediness for intimacy and fear of commitment, is also evident in his other letters.
My one fear, surely nothing worse can either be said or listened to, is that I shall never be able to possess you. At best I would be conned, like an unthinkingly faithful dog, to kissing your casually proffered hand, which would not be a sign of love, but of the despair of the animal condemned to silence and eternal separation. I would sit beside you, and, as has happened, feel the breath and life of your body at my side, yet in reality be further from you than now, here in my room. I would never be able to attract your attention, and it would be lost to me altogether when you look out of the window or lay your head in your hands. You and I would ride past the entire world, hand in hand, seemingly united, and none of it would be true. In short, though you might lean toward me far enough for you to be in danger, I would be excluded from you forever. If this be true, Felice, and to me there seems to be no doubt, then surely I had good reason to want with all my might to part from you 6 months ago, and moreover good reason to fear any conventional bond with you, since the consequences of any such bond could only be the severing of my desire from the feeble forces that still sustain me, who am unfit for this earth, on this earth today. I am stopping, Felice. I have written enough for today.
This was neither the first nor the last time Kafka described himself as an animal. Kafka often ruminated upon the notion of dehumanization, and his most common way of alluding to it was to use comparisons to animals. An obvious example would be Kafka's A Hunger Artist, where the titular protagonist is literally replaced by an animal at the end of the story. And of course, this offers a new layer of psychoanalytic meaning to the metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa literally becomes a monstrous vermin. In his biography of Kafka, Rainer Stach wrote,
Kafka had likened animal imagery to the idea of horrendous degradation from an early age. As a keenly observant child, he must have concluded that it was a curse to be an animal. In the 1890s, overworked horses were a regular part of the metropolitan street scene. No adult gave a second thought to the creatures living in captivity in the zoo and the circus, or to the inferno of the slaughterhouses. Animals suffer, but their suffering is not entered in the moral accounting of human history. They are mute. Their forms of expression are not considered language. Above all, they have no concept of shame. They present their bodies in a way that constantly and painfully reminds people of their own animal nature, evoking disgust, revulsion, and cruelty.
This ties in well with Kafka's tendency to view himself and the people around him as meat. His mind would focus on physical imperfections, obsessing over them, mirroring Gregor Samsa's body dysmorphia.
Well aware as I am of my own exaggerated sensitivity in this respect, I am also fully conscious of the moral, extraordinary, and from a distance, even beautiful aspect of the entire spectacle. But there, of course, in the midst of it, sat my poor mother, who has never had the time or ever learned how to keep her body in proper shape, and who is now bloated and bent from work and giving birth to 6 children. There, purple in the face, sat my father, whose complaint was not improved by the quiet life in Franzensbad. There sat my eldest sister, who but 2 years ago was still a young girl, yet whose body, after producing a couple of children, is now really beginning, more from neglect and ignorance than from lack of time, to resemble that of my mother. And there she sat, her figure bulging out of some extraordinary corset, and on closer scrutiny, even my middle sister is showing signs of looking like the eldest.
Some of you may notice an element of tension in Kafka's descriptions of his family, and you would be right. Franz Kafka suffered lifelong abuse at the hands of his narcissistic father, Hermann Kafka. I don't want to get too derailed by this topic, but it is important to briefly discuss it, because it is a core underlying theme in Gregor Samsa's relationship with his own father, and once again I'll be focusing on the psychosexual aspect of it.
At that time, and at that time in every way, I would have needed encouragement. I was, after all, weighed down by your mere physical presence. I remember, for instance, how we often undressed in the same bathing hut. There was I, skinny, weakly, slight, you strong, tall, broad. Even inside the hut I felt a miserable specimen, and what's more, not only in your eyes, but in the eyes of the whole world, for you were for me the measure of all things. But then when we stepped out of the bathing hut before the people, you holding me by my hand, a little skeleton, unsteady, barefoot on the boards, frightened of the water, incapable of copying your swimming strokes, which you, with the best of intentions, but actually to my profound humiliation, always kept on showing me. Then I was frantic with desperation, and at such moments, all my bad experiences in all spheres fitted magnificently together. I felt best when you sometimes undressed first, and I was able to stay behind in the hut alone and put off the disgrace of showing myself in public, until at last you came to see what I was doing and drove me out of the hut. I was grateful to you for not seeming to notice my anguish, and besides, I was proud of my father's body. By the way, this difference between us remains much the same to this very day.
We can easily see how Kafka felt eclipsed by his father's masculinity in a way quite similar to Gregor. Hermann Kafka was a self-made man who managed to build a very successful business. The Kafka family was quite well off, with Franz Kafka himself working as a somewhat high-ranking government bureaucrat. In fact, when Franz Kafka was drafted into the Great War, he was given a deferment due to the importance of his job. The success of Kafka's father in building wealth and raising a family made Kafka feel insignificant, because even though he was a very sociable man with many friends and lovers, Kafka never married. This, for both Kafka and his father, was viewed as a huge failure, especially since Kafka had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1917, so the prospect of ever having a family was becoming more and more improbable.
Marrying, founding a family, accepting all the children that come, supporting them in this insecure world and perhaps even guiding them a little, is, I am convinced, the utmost a human being can succeed in doing at all.
It should be noted, though, that marriage for Kafka wouldn't have been the salvation he had been seeking for, because even marriage felt shameful to him.
What you advised me to do was, in your opinion, and even more in my opinion at that time, the filthiest thing possible. That you wanted to see to it that I should not bring any of the physical filth home with me was unimportant, for you were only protecting yourself, your house. The important thing was rather that you yourself remained outside your own advice. A married man, a pure man, above such things. This was probably intensified for me at the time by the fact that even marriage seemed to me shameless, and hence it was impossible for me to apply to my parents the general information I had picked up about marriage. Thus you became still purer, rose still higher. The thought that you might have given yourself similar advice before your marriage was to me utterly unthinkable, so there was hardly any smudge of earthly filth on you at all, and it was you who pushed me down into this filth, just as though I were predestined to it, with a few frank words, and so if the world consisted only of me and you, a notion I was much inclined to have, then this purity of the world came to an end with you, and by virtue of your advice the filth began with me.
And now we see how it all connects. In Kafka's mind, it wasn't sexuality itself that was filthy, but his sexuality specifically. Engaging with it meant dirtying himself, becoming disgusting. Gregor's transformation is the superlative form of this sexual indulgence.
I am dirty, Milena, infinitely dirty. This is why I scream so much about purity. No one sings as purely as those who inhabit the deepest hell. What we take to be the song of angels is their song.
As the years passed, Kafka's writings became increasingly morose and regretful.
A moment of thought, resign yourself, learn, 40-year-old, to rest content in the moment. Yes, once you could do it. Yes, in the moment, the terrible moment. It is not terrible, only your fear of the future makes it so, and also looking back on it in retrospect. What have you done with your gift of sex? It was a failure. In the end, that is all that they will say. But it might easily have succeeded. A mere trifle, indeed so small as not to be perceived, decided between its failure and success. Why are you surprised? So it was, with the greatest battles in the history of the world. Trifles decide trifles. Of course, it is never as clear as all that, or rather, it is. It is always as clear as all that. For instance, sex keeps gnawing at me, hounds me day and night. I should have to conquer fear and shame, and probably sorrow too, to satisfy it. Yet on the other hand, I am certain that I should at once take advantage, with no feeling of fear or sorrow or shame, of the first opportunity to present itself quickly, close at hand, and willingly. According to the above, then, I am left with the law that fear, etc., should not be conquered, but also that one should not continually dally with the idea of conquest, but rather take advantage of opportunities as they come, and not complain if none should come.
While he had previously used written correspondence as a way to express himself better and to keep his lovers at a distance, in his later years, Kafka seemed to have felt deep regret that so many opportunities were lost, describing the very act of writing letters as having sex with ghosts.
Writing letters is actually an intercourse with ghosts, and by no means just with the ghost of the addressee, but also with one's own ghost, which secretly evolves inside the letter one is writing, or even in a whole series of letters, where one letter corroborates another and can refer to it as witness. How did people ever get the idea they could communicate with one another by letter? One can think about someone far away, and one can hold on to someone nearby. Everything else is beyond human power. Writing letters, on the other hand, means exposing oneself to the ghosts, who are greedily waiting precisely for that. Written kisses never arrive at their destination. The ghosts drink them up along the way. It is this ample nourishment which enables them to multiply so enormously. People sense this and struggle against it. In order to eliminate as much of the ghost's power as possible, and to attain a natural intercourse, a tranquility of soul, they have invented trains, cars, airplanes, but nothing helps anymore. These are evidently inventions devised at the moment of crashing. The opposing side is so much calmer and stronger. After the postal system, the ghosts invented the telegraph, the telephone, the wireless. They will not starve, but we will perish.
In that same year, Kafka started writing The Castle, a novel he never finished. According to his manuscripts, Kafka began writing The Castle in the first person, but once he got to writing a sex scene between the protagonist and a barmaid named Frida, he suddenly changed the point of view mid-story to the third person.
"My darling, my sweet darling," she said in a whisper, but without touching Kay. As if unconscious in her love, she lay on her back and stretched out her arms. Time must have seemed endless in her happy love. She sighed, rather than sang some little song. Then she started, for Kay was still silent, lost in thought, and like a child she began to tug at him. "Come, it's stifling down here." They embraced each other. Her small body was burning in Kay's hands. They rolled a few paces in an unconscious state, from which Kay repeatedly but vainly tried to rescue himself, bumped dully against Clam's door, and then lay in the small puddles of beer and other rubbish with which the floor was covered. Hours passed there, hours breathing together with a single heartbeat, hours in which Kay constantly felt he was lost, or had wandered farther into foreign lands than any human being before him. So foreign that even the air hadn't a single component of the air in his homeland, and where one would inevitably suffocate from the foreignness, but where the meaningless enticements were such that one had no alternative but to go on and get even more lost.
Once again, we see Kafka's struggle with sexual shame and alienation. Even in a fictional story, Kafka couldn't see himself indulging in his sexual desires, and so he created a surrogate named Kay. The sex scene itself is physically dirty, just like Kafka's thoughts. In a later scene, Kafka once again likens himself to an animal through the protagonist.
They lay there, but without abandoning themselves as fully as that time at night. She sought something, and he sought something, in a fury. Grimacing, they sought with their heads boring into each other's breasts. Their embraces and arched bodies, far from making them forget, reminded them of their duty to keep searching, like dogs desperately pawing at the earth. They pawed at each other's bodies, and then, helpless and disappointed, in an effort to catch one last bit of happiness, their tongues occasionally ran all over each other's faces. Only weariness made them lie still and be grateful to each other. Then the maids came up. "Look at the way they're lying there," one of them said, and out of pity she threw a sheet over them.
Kafka soon abandoned this story and lost interest in finishing it. 2 years later, in 1924, Franz Kafka died of tuberculosis at the age of 40, just as he had predicted. Before his death, he had instructed his best friend, Max Brod, to destroy all of his unfinished manuscripts. However, Brod disobeyed him, and this is why so many of Kafka's works have survived. While humanity greatly benefited from this act of betrayal, we must neither ignore nor forget the fact that Kafka's privacy, consent, and dignity were all deeply violated in the process. In a bitter turn of irony that Kafka himself would probably have appreciated, his shame, has outlived him. So, now that I've shared my interpretation of the Metamorphosis and its connection to Kafka's life, you will understand why I consider Urobuchi Gen's The Song of Saya the love letter written specifically for him, a response to all his shame and insecurities and alienation.
Real darkness has love for a face.
As mentioned earlier, The Song of Saya was published in 2003 and tells the story of Sakisaka Fuminori, whose life acts as the direct inversion of Gregor Samsa's. Sakisaka Fuminori is a med student at the University of Tokyo who wakes up one day to find that the world has somehow been transformed into a monstrous landscape. That's right, Fuminori's experience is literally the inverse of Gregor Samsa's. Fuminori was involved in a car accident that killed his parents, leaving him the only survivor. However, due to extensive brain damage caused by the crash, he underwent experimental surgery to save his life, as a result of which he has developed a fictional form of agnosia that makes his brain perceive everything around him as never-ending patterns of decaying flesh.
It looks like someone sprayed the walls with pig guts from ceiling to floor. What colour should the hospital walls be? White, of course, and to the creatures of rotten flesh shambling around me, I'm sure this hallway looks just as white as it should. I know, intellectually, that the walls are white. I know that the flesh beasts are really human. I'm the one with the problem, and it's because I've accepted this that I'm able to lead something approaching a normal life.
While only his vision was affected in the beginning, through the power of suggestion, his other senses quickly followed. What looked disgusting to him soon also smelled disgusting, sounded disgusting, tasted disgusting, and felt disgusting.
Soon, my disorder spread to the senses of touch, taste, and smell. As it turns out, sight exerts tremendous influence over the other four. The taste of my food, the feel of my bed sheets, the fragrance of my get-well flowers, all became as unbearably foul as my eyes said they should be. Eventually, when even the doctors' voices became unrecognizable as human, I decided to kill myself. I didn't believe for a second that I could live in this world.
Fuminori's entire life has become a waking nightmare. Everything is monstrous, but only he can perceive it. And just like it was with Gregor Samsa, the transition gradually becomes more and more internalized. Every conversation, every interaction with another human being has become an insufferable exercise of alienation, but Fuminori has to maintain a social life in order to appear normal, so he still hangs out with his friends.
By listening carefully, I am able to grasp the gist of their conversation and respond when it is required of me. This is necessary to avoid arousing their suspicion. However these creatures look, they are my friends, apparently. I wish that I could still deny it, but I gave up on that a long time ago. Night after night, I went to sleep praying for an end to this nightmare, only to wake each morning to the same twisted hellscape as the day before. I know now that I have to blend in, that I have to act like one of them.
Both here and in Kafka's work, it is very easy to spot subtle allusions to autism, especially if the reader is autistic themselves. In both cases, the world is described with a strong element of unwelcomeness, a place in which it's impossible to belong. It's always about pretending to be one of them. Of course, this could also work as an allegory for depression, where things we used to love suddenly become alien to us. There are many valid ways to interpret this, and I don't want to widen the scope of this video too much, so I will only be touching upon these peripheral topics briefly. But it is true that Fuminori repeatedly expresses overt thoughts of depression and isolation.
If only no one recognized me, I might have been able to disconnect myself from the world. The world as I knew it is gone. I have no place to call home.
Just like the Metamorphosis, the narrative of the Song of Saya begins after the transformation has already taken place. Just like we didn't get to see how Gregor was before the events of the story, we only get to know Fuminori after the accident. His best friends, Koji, Omi, and Yo, all assume that Fuminori's new behaviors of distance and reclusion are caused by the trauma of the accident, so they try to be patient with him. But for Fuminori, merely being in the presence of them is unbearable.
Judging by its tone, this one must be Koji, and the one next to him, squealing more than others, is probably Omi, which means that the one next to me is Yo, though I can no longer see any trace of her once attractive features. I try my best to ignore the rotten stench of excrement that issues from her quivering flesh.
Once again, we see a strong similarity to Kafka in the raw physicality with which the fading beauty of a woman is described, more as meat than as a person. For Fuminori, this is far more literal than Kafka ever imagined. The same physicality is also utilized to elicit disgust, as Fuminori's friends, whom he used to love, have become these wriggling blobs of melted flesh, their words spittles of sticky pus sprayed in his direction every time they speak.
A slimy hole near the top of the creature writhes nauseatingly as it vomits some semblance of words. That must be Koji's face, or what I would have seen as such 3 months ago. Unable to stomach the sight of it, I avert my eyes and give a neutral answer. A spray of stringy slime from the cilia around its voice box flies at me. I try to cover myself, but too late to keep the slime from splattering across my face like the yolk of a rotten egg. I'm about to lose it. I want to grab a chair, a desk, anything within reach, and use it to smash the life out of this creature, ending it all.
This thought takes place in the very first scene of the story, and it is quite striking. From the very beginning, we see Fuminori express a thought of naked fury and unmitigated violence. It demonstrates how easy it is to dehumanize someone if they don't look like what you expect a human to look like. It also very aptly illustrates how disgust can easily translate to hatred. And just like Gregor Samsa was dehumanized by his family for being different, Fuminori has dehumanized the entire world, even his best friends. Koji is Fuminori's best friend since childhood, and Omi is Koji's girlfriend. Yo is Omi's best friend.
These were my closest companions. One of them had even wished to be more. How many nights have I spent crying in loneliness, lamenting the friends who no longer exist? In 3 months my tears ran dry, and now there is only loathing left in me.
Right before the accident, Yo had confessed her feelings to Fuminori, but Fuminori did not give a definitive answer, opting to consider her proposition first. Then the accident happened, and Fuminori never broached the subject ever again. Now, Yo is not sure if Fuminori even remembers her confession, so the state of their relationship is in flux.
Fuminori is the victim, just as Koji said. He's the one who most deserves sympathy. Yo's feelings for Fuminori are her problem, and no one else's. She doesn't blame Fuminori for not giving her an answer after she worked up the courage to ask him out. In fact, she thinks even more fondly of him for taking the time to consider than she would have had he treated their relationship casually. Apparently, the fact that Fuminori did not reject her was enough to make them a couple in Koji and Omi's eyes. They've had plenty of fun at Yo and Fuminori's expense since. The truth of it, though, is that he still hasn't given her an answer. After revealing her feelings to him, Yo didn't see Fuminori again until a week later, and then she could only stare at his broken body through the window of the ICU. And when he was finally released, after 50 days that seemed an eternity, he was somehow different. She's starting to doubt that he even remembers what she confessed to him before the accident.
This is yet another interesting similarity to Kafka. Fuminori's accident could be interpreted as the manifestation of anxiety and sexual insecurity brought on by the actualization of his and Yo's relationship. Just like Kafka was engaged multiple times and never married, forever chasing intimacy and closeness but at the same time being terrified by them, so too Fuminori was faced with a looming burden of commitment right before the accident. And this is where Saya comes in. When Fuminori woke up in the hospital, he was terrified by what he saw. He couldn't recognize his friends. All he saw was monsters in a hellish landscape. He was going insane.
He was worse when we went to see him in the hospital, remember? Koji said. He was terrified of us, like he didn't know who we were. He even had to be tied to the bed. He freaked out so bad. I'm just glad he's made it this far.
But then, one night, he woke up and saw Saya, standing by his hospital bed, smiling at him. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't look like a pile of entrails. She looked like a beautiful young girl.
One night, while thinking of a painless way to die, I found myself succumbing to sleep, drifting between the nightmares in my dreams and the nightmare of reality. I didn't notice her enter my room. The next thing I knew, there was a face staring down at me from next to my bed. The face was not covered in pus or slime or earthworm-like feelers. It had smooth white cheeks, round eyes, a lovely little nose, all things I had never expected to see again. The face was that of a girl, undeniably human and positively glowing with beauty.
Saya was both surprised and disappointed by Fuminori's positive reaction. As she was about to leave, Fuminori tried to stop her.
"Wait!" I cried, desperate to keep her from leaving. It was only after she turned around that I realized I hadn't thought of what to say next. Her beautiful eyes drew me in, healing my soul to its core. Through the white haze clouding my mind, I struggled to form a coherent sentence. "I shouldn't do this to a girl, but you're the only one I can ask." No longer concerned with propriety, I let the words come out as they willed. "Will you let me hold your hand?" Saya looked confused at first, but then she smiled like she'd just found a new toy. Her smile was brighter than my memories of the sun. Ever so carefully, as though catching snowflakes, I placed my palm against hers. I could feel her human warmth and the softness of her delicate fingers. She was there, just beyond the palm of my hand.
And this is how Fuminori's life was saved. Saya became the reason he decided not to kill himself. Saya was perfectly beautiful, forever young, pure, in a decaying world. Yo could never compete with that.
She was a strange girl. On the one hand, she looked and acted like a child. On the other, she was remarkably self-reliant, and at times exhibited a sharp intelligence and deep knowledge that many may have found unsettling. I didn't care. Saya was the only other human in a world gone mad. Her existence meant far more to me than the standards of society.
Saya explained to Fuminori that she lived in the hospital and liked pranking the mental ward patients.
"Sometimes I sneak into their rooms late at night and scare them," Saya said, grinning mischievously. "Even if they raise a fuss, no one believes what mental patients say. They just brush it off as a bad dream."
Fuminori asked Saya to stop doing that and instead come to his room to hang out every night. She agreed, and so Saya and Fuminori met every night at his hospital room, which gave him both the willingness and the courage to start getting better.
With extreme care, I was able to conceal my sensory disorder. It was glaringly obvious that the doctors had no way to cure me, and the fact that I had undergone a still experimental procedure made me even more cautious. As a medical student, it was easy for me to imagine how the doctors would react if they discovered that I was exhibiting such unusual side effects. I was not about to become a guinea pig, a mere specimen to be examined with clinical detachment, and so I hid my discomfort and loathing behind a mask of normalcy, convincing the doctors that any signs of stress were merely a result of hospitalization. Saya was my support. Looking forward to her nightly visits gave me the strength to endure my daily torture. Hope can make an enormous difference in a patient's progress. With the aid of my secret nurse, I recovered at a pace that left the doctors stunned.
At this point, I should explain that Fuminori's thought process is not strange for Japanese society. In Japan, the stigma of mental illness is much stronger than it is in the West, even today. Being committed to a mental institution was not a far-fetched idea in the 2000s, just like it was in the West during the 1980s. Right before being discharged from the hospital, Fuminori asked Saya to come live with him. She said she would think about it, mirroring Fuminori's response to Yo.
But Saya never appeared. After Koji and the others dropped me off, I paused a while to regard my surroundings. I had lived my entire life on this block, in this house. There was no other place that I could call home, but nothing was as I remembered. As I walked up the path to the front door and took in the yard where I had spent my childhood, I could feel those memories being defiled by the twisted, festering shapes around me. Inside the house, I found nothing familiar, nothing to offer me comfort or warmth. What I had once called home was now a whole other world. I stepped into the room that had cradled me from childhood. The walls were papered with human entrails, the bed a tangled mass of worm flesh. But none of that mattered. There, curled up on the bed like an abandoned cat, was Saya.
And that is how Fuminori and Saya ended up living together. Saya has become Fuminori's anchor in this new world. She's the only thing he cares about, and Saya seems to enjoy taking care of him. Just like Greta helped Gregor by cooking him different foods to see what he would like, so too Saya did the same with both the cooking and the interior decoration of Fuminori's house.
I realized one day that if the natural colors of the world were sickening, all I had to do was paint over them with colors that seemed pleasant. I went to the hardware store and bought every color of paint I could find. Then Saya and I tried different combinations until we found one that worked. After painting the bedroom from ceiling to floor, I was finally able to get my first good night's sleep since the accident. When we first started on the living room, Saya, unsure what to do with the curtains, just painted carefully around the windows. Without a moment's hesitation, I tore the curtains down and painted over the glass itself. There will never be anything out there that I'd want to see, and as long as we keep the storm shutters closed, the neighbors probably won't think anything of it.
Once again, we see Fuminori's desire for isolation. Nothing else matters, only his obsession with Saya. He starts seeing her as his wife, though Saya seems to view him as a pet she enjoys taking care of. Again, just like Greta's relationship with Gregor, there is a distinct caregiver role with a hint of power.
As has become routine, I steel myself and methodically transport the food into my mouth. The taste is as gut-wrenching as expected, but it's not Saya's fault. I'm sure she made it exactly like the cooking show said. It's just that my taste buds can't accept it. In my current state, eating is nothing more than an unwelcome duty. As much as I hate it, I need food to survive. If I stay alive, then perhaps one day, as Saya says, I'll be able to taste something delicious again.
Of course, one key difference from the Metamorphosis is that the relationship between Fuminori and Saya is overtly sexual, and this is where the Song of Saya truly shows its admiration for Franz Kafka. Even though his sex acts with Saya are described in gratuitous explicitness, Fuminori is never mindfully present. He is so lost in his ruminations, riddled with self-doubt and denial, that he barely even enjoys the act itself.
Who could imagine that her seemingly incorruptible body would ever glisten with the hot sweat of passion, or feast on pleasure with such bottomless lust? Saya, my darling Saya, is this really what you want? Why do you go so far for me? What am I that you can give yourself to me, body and soul? Is this merely sympathy? Do you pity me, the exile from society? Is that enough for you to surrender yourself to such mad desire? Are you so wanton? Her eyes, as she gazes down upon me, are devoid of twisted or sinful desire. There are only the melting flames of ecstasy. Her beautiful carnal moans and undulating body seem impossible, dreamlike, and I cannot help but wonder if even the pleasure searing my flesh is but an illusion. Needing to reassure myself that she's real, I raise my hands to her breasts and seize them like my life depends on it. Saya convulses, screaming like an animal.
To Fuminori, sex with Saya is confirmation that she is real, that he is not insane, that she is not a figment of his imagination. Saya is real.
She is here. She is with me now. Only in this moment is her existence certain. Only when I am joined with her can I believe. No matter what cruel fate might await me, Saya, there is nothing I fear more than losing you.
During those moments, Fuminori can forget the hostile world he lives in. Saya herself has become his refuge, his haven from a realm of alienation. There is no judgment in Saya's eyes, no shame, no hesitancy. She is the perfect woman, one who accepts him fully and doesn't question him or demand anything from him. Saya is overflowing with unabashed desire for him, but not in a dirty way that taints her. Her sexuality does not tarnish her innocence or purity. This juxtaposition between Yo, a real woman who was romantically interested in Fuminori, and the mysteriously lustful Saya is an amazing representation of the type of anxiety Franz Kafka himself described in both his letters and diary whenever he thought about marriage. At school, Yo decides to confront Fuminori about the status of the relationship. Even though she is normally not an assertive person, she approaches him to finally have a discussion about it.
Now that they are face to face, Yo is painfully aware of how much weight Fuminori has lost. His sunken eyes and protruding cheekbones are a far cry from the features familiar to her. She wonders whether he's under a lot of stress, or perhaps not getting enough nutrition. Maybe it's both. He definitely looks more tense than he should, afraid even, though of what she can't imagine. His eyes move restlessly from point to point, and he refuses to look Yo in the eye. It hurts to see Fuminori this way. What could have changed him so?
Yo tries to broach the subject as gently as possible. She remembers how Koji warned her to be respectful of Fuminori's trauma.
It's times like these, Yo implores, trying to convey the sincerity of her feelings for him, that you need your friends. I feel really bad about your parents, but you're not alone. You have Koji and Omi, and you have me. I think we can help you, so you don't have to deal with it all by yourself. Even if we can't do anything, just talking to us might make you feel better.
Fuminori interrupts her with a look of murderously cold hatred.
Come to think of it, I never gave you an answer, did I? Fuminori says. I never saw you in any special way before. When you asked me out, I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't know how I really felt about you at the time. But now I can give you an answer. I've had plenty of time to think it over, you know. I hate you, Tsukuba. I don't even want to look at you. I suppose it's too much to hope I never see you again. We do go to the same school, so just make this the last time you speak to me, okay? Your voice makes me sick.
Upon hearing this, Yo runs away in humiliation, trying to hide her tears from him. Fuminori watches her leave with a cold smile on his face.
I feel awful, miserable, but also refreshed. I finally crossed the line. I knew it would come crashing down like this sooner or later. Having become unable to feel anything but disgust for other people, there was no way I could hope to maintain the relationships I'd had before the accident. Today's incident will definitely get back to Koji and Omi, and everyone will be convinced I've had a major change of character. Honestly, I don't care anymore. At least I probably won't be committed for this. I just need to avoid acting any stranger than I already have. If this puts a rift between me and the others, good. The thought of all the stress I'll avoid brings a smile to my lips. I'm fed up with them sticking their noses into my life. It's like they don't care that they make my gut turn just by being near me. I've been terrified of them until now, but today I struck fear into one of them. In that sense, it's something of a relief, but I'm not entirely without remorse for what happened.
When Gregor Samsa's family saw Gregor as a monster, they soon started treating him as such. Likewise, when Fuminori sees the world as monstrous, he can no longer see the humanity in people. Empathy is heavily intertwined with our sense of aesthetics. We treat those we find attractive better. We treat those who look more like us better. The very concept of personhood is quickly forgotten when we stop perceiving someone as human. Paradoxically, while Gregor was the one who was turned into a monster, it is the humans around him who act like monsters. Similarly, when Fuminori lives in a monstrous world, it is he who becomes the monster. Omi, Koji's girlfriend and Yo's best friend, is furious at Fuminori for speaking so harshly to Yo, and so she decides to confront him after school. She arrives at the Sakisaka house and is disgusted by how dilapidated it looks.
Perhaps Fuminori has a good reason for shutting out the world, but Omi can only see it as a lack of respect for others. Her anger rekindled, she pushes the gate open and stomps through the yard to the front door.
It's important to notice the subtle critique of Japan's pervading culture of conformity. In Japan, individualism and isolation from the community are often viewed as selfish, which is why autism is still heavily stigmatized to this day. As mentioned earlier, this is simply another layer of the story's core themes. After all, many modern scholars theorize that Franz Kafka himself exhibited traits consistent with autism. So Omi opens the front door to Fuminori's house and walks in. She is immediately assaulted by a choking stench and hears a shrieking animalistic voice coming from inside the house. Confused, she calls out to the voice, but there is no response. She hears a wet, flopping sound bubbling somewhere in the house. More curious than angry, Omi decides to investigate, despite the sickening smell, by walking farther inside.
Suddenly she feels something cold seeping through her socks. She timidly reaches down to touch her feet. Her fingertips come away covered with a viscous olive-green slime, like the filthy water from a tank long clogged with algae and dead fish. The whole floor is covered with it. It must be the source of the stench.
Omi walks into the den and turns on the light.
The colours, so many colours. The purple of entrails, the brown of rotten meat, the crimson of fresh blood, the yellow of fat. These colours, and more that cannot be described, cover every inch of the room in maddening array. The colours say all that needs to be said about the painter's hatred, malice and insanity.
As Omi gazes upon the madness of this room, she is suddenly attacked by Saya.
Omi's legs give out from the shock, sending her to the floor. Slime immediately soaks through her jeans, its cold tendrils creeping up her legs, crotch, and her neck. Her hand flies to her neck, where it is greeted by another drop of chilly slime. Above her, something is dripping down on her head, making perhaps the worst decision of her life. Omi looks up, the predator clinging to the ceiling poised to leap upon its prey. She sees it in every detail. Her mouth and nose are sealed before she can scream, and her belly is torn open as something enters to feast on her innards.
This long telegraphed revelation recontextualizes a lot of what we have already seen in the story so far. Saya is not an innocent little girl. Saya is a predator who preys on humans. Once again, This serves as a subversion of our expectations in regards to relational power dynamics. Because of how she looks, at least through the eyes of Fuminori, we may be tempted to assume that Fuminori is the predator who seduced Saya and turned her into a tradwife. But in reality, it is Saya who has adopted Fuminori for her own amusement. Just like she scared mentally ill patients for fun, Fuminori is simply her newest toy. Soon afterwards, Fuminori walks into his home and catches Saya eating Omi's dead body.
Something smells strange, though not unpleasant. The aroma is quite soothing, in fact. It reminds me of Saya's hair. At first, I am surprised by what I see in the living room. The floor is covered with what looks to be some kind of grass, probably the source of the herb-like smell, and there are fruit and vegetable-like orbs of varying size scattered everywhere.
Driven by the appetizing smell and appearance of this food, Fuminori joins Saya in eating Omi.
I scoop up the closest fruit thing and pop it into my mouth, ignoring Saya's attempt to wave me off. It has a strange texture, soft and pliable, like a peach or a pear. When I bite into it with my back teeth, a succulent juice fills my mouth, combined with a sharp, strong fragrance. It's unlike anything I've ever tasted. At first, Saya looks dumbstruck, but then she bursts out laughing. "So this is what you like? Now I feel stupid for going to all that trouble."
Since the food problem is finally solved, and Fuminori has finally found something he finds tasty, they happily store the rest of Omi in the freezer.
Sealing the small fruits in Tupperware and the large ones in pots and bowls, Saya and I store the remaining food in the refrigerator. Thinking of tomorrow's dinner fills me with anticipation. I feel that little by little, I'm starting to regain the joy of living. Saya will guide me. With her, I can live on.
A few days later, Fuminori's routine is disrupted when he returns home from his daily tasks and Saya isn't there. He is immediately struck by anxiety and fear of abandonment.
The seconds crawl by, each tick of the clock compounding my agony. When I returned from the Ogai residence, I was greeted by a silent, empty home. Saya had vanished without leaving any clue as to her whereabouts. It isn't rare for her to go for walks at night. I've often gone with her. However, such outings always take place in the middle of the night, when no one is around, and never last for more than 2 hours. Right now, it's 5 in the morning. Soon the sky will begin to show the first light of dawn. Even if she left right before I returned, she's still been gone for almost half a day. I can't sleep. I can only wait in anguish. I tried to distract myself by painting more rooms, but I couldn't concentrate on the work.
Fuminori starts to unravel at the possibility that Saya never returns.
If Saya doesn't return, the thought makes me want to tear out my hair. After its long absence, the terror of true loneliness is too much to bear. At last, the cowbell chimes and Saya's long-awaited "I'm home" rings out from the bottom of the stairs. As I jump out of my bed in relief, all of the stress that has built up through the night is released in a wave that threatens to sweep me off my feet.
Saya explains that she decided to go back to the hospital and steal Fuminori's medical files. She thinks that if she studies them enough, she'll be able to fix his condition, albeit with some experimenting first. Fuminori is confused and tired from staying up all night, so he doesn't understand. He says he's going to bed. Saya reacts to this by tossing the files aside and undressing Fuminori.
Contrary to her appearance, Saya's appetite for sex would put any adult to shame. You could even say it's a little unnatural. She's not just passionate, she also has unlimited stamina, making me wonder where her slender body gets all the energy. Never satisfied, she always uses me to pleasure herself, until I'm forced to tap out.
As Saya performs oral sex on him, Fuminori once again spends the entire time lost in his own thoughts, arguing with himself.
Looking down, I see her tiny mouth stretching the graceful lines of her cheeks and jaw so far that I fear she might break. The sight makes me worry that she's pushing herself too hard, but she continues to devour me like a kitten desperately nursing on its mother. As I watch, I begin to feel like I'm violating Saya's innocent, unsullied face. The feeling of breaking a taboo further increases my perverted ecstasy. In every man lurks the dark desire to spoil that which is beautiful. Saya's bewitching body, able to drive me mad every night, is perfectly designed to draw out such savage lusts.
There's a strong Jungian element to this scene with a side of Nietzsche. Just like Gregor Samsa, Fuminori's lust is wrapped in shame he has inherited from the world he grew up in. As his mind wobbles between indulgence and self-loathing, he finds justification in the thought that his desires are universal. All men are like this. And this reassurance is twofold. First, it means that if all men feel this way, then it is not wrong for him to do so as well. Second, if all men feel this way, then he is one of the very few who have acted upon this secret desire. This elevates Fuminori above other men, ushered into this exclusive class of superior men who tower over others, because he is not burdened by the morality of weaker men. And just as it happened earlier, we see how fragile this construct is, because as soon as he ejaculates, Fuminori is flooded with self-doubt once again.
I'm worried about her, but my body is at its limit. As irresistible waves of pleasure sweep away my willpower, I unleash my pent-up seed deep into Saya's throat. What have I done? I feel panic rise within me. This is the first time I've ever had a girl do this to me. To be honest, I'm speechless with shock. I've always been prejudiced against this sort of thing, thinking it to be something that perverted, sadistic men force women to do. But Saya... She looks up at me, answering my apprehension by smiling like she'd just pulled the greatest prank of her life.
This punctuates the irony of Fuminori's brief masculine satisfaction, because Saya was always in control of this act, and all others. Saya is the one seducing Fuminori, not the other way around. But Fuminori's traditionalist sensibilities are so deeply ingrained that he is oblivious to the fact that Saya is the predator.
I love you, Fuminori, she purrs softly. With her body draped over mine, I become even more aware of how light and delicate she is. Can this tiny girl and I really live as husband and wife? I feel a pang of self-loathing at the question. How can I still be afraid after all that's happened? Saya's feelings are so earnest. How can I not accept them? I need to resolve once and for all to rid myself of the useless trappings of morality. Saya and I are all that matters. There is no point in worrying about what others think anymore.
Saya tells Fuminori that she loves him for the first time. Fuminori doesn't answer anything back. Instead, he falls asleep, still thinking about his own insecurities. Fuminori escaped from the anxieties of a relationship with Yo into a relationship with Saya. Once again, he is asked to commit, and once again Fuminori reacts with avoidance.
By the time I drift to sleep in the comforting embrace of exhaustion, all doubts about Saya's actions have vanished from my mind. Whatever the case, all that matters is that she's returned to me.
The next day, Saya attacks Fuminori's neighbor, Suzumi Yosuke, in his home, but she doesn't eat him like she did with Omi.
Thin, tube-like appendages penetrate his ears and nose, wriggling deep into his skull. Right before the sensation drives him mad, Yosuke loses consciousness.
When he awakens, Yosuke finds himself in the same predicament as Fuminori. The whole world has turned monstrous.
It's everywhere. The thing that attacked him in the living room, it's everywhere.
After a long struggle, he manages to lift himself up from the endless carpet of worms and takes in his environment.
Most terrifying of all, this hellish place has the same layout as Yosuke's house. In a half-mad daze, he wanders through the nightmarish mockery of his home. In the small room where his studio should be, he finds an easel made of bones displaying a blood-soaked canvas. Like some cruel joke, everything is exactly where it would be in Yosuke's studio. Howling, Yosuke lashes out against everything within reach. The easel of bone shatters, driving splinters into his fist.
Meanwhile, his wife and daughter return home.
Yosuke hears the sound of something slimy sloshing its way up the stairs. Even as he cowers in terror, he slides his trembling hand across the floor and grabs one of the bones from the broken easel. The tip of the bone is nice and sharp. If he holds it in both hands and puts his weight behind it, he might be able to use it to defend himself.
His wife enters the room and Yosuke attacks her.
Yosuke leaps on the creature as it enters, fear turning his roar into a high-pitched scream. The flesh beast is covered in sludge and vile juices, but before horror can paralyze him, Yosuke brings his bone stake stabbing down. The monster screams as the stake pierces its chest and punches through to the other side. It falls back, writhing in agony. The sight of its pain sets Yosuke's blood on fire. Yosuke grabs the bone and twists with all his might. The monster convulses and gurgles, its trembling tentacles reaching up as though begging for help. Yosuke knocks it to the floor, then brings his heel crashing down on its flopping body again and again. With each stomp, its groans and spasms grow weaker. When the monster at last stops twitching, Yosuke, panting hard, tears the stake from its corpse and rises to his feet.
Then, Yosuke's daughter calls to him.
Yosuke turns around to see another, smaller monster peeking out at him from the stair landing. His desperate, rage-filled attack both exhilarated him and gave him a taste for violence. This one will be easier. It's smaller and weaker. Grinning maniacally, Yosuke raises his stake and moves toward the second creature. The monster flees down the stairs. Not about to let his prey escape, Yosuke roars and gives chase. The thought that killing the monsters might end this nightmare feeds his savage bloodlust. When the monster trips and falls in the dining room, Yosuke leaps on top of it and brings the stake crashing down. His bloodlust unsated, he pulls it free, then drives it again in the monster's flesh, again and again, until there is nothing left but shredded pulverized meat. Eventually, the only sound in the house is Yosuke's heavy breathing. He has slain 2 monsters, but the nightmare shows no sign of ending.
Yosuke staggers to the front door and goes outside, and realizes that the entire earth, including the sky, has turned into this monstrous landscape. And then he sees Saya.
She is standing in front of the house next door, wearing a spotless dress over her pure white skin. In the midst of this filth-ridden world, she alone glows with beauty.
Saya exclaims that her experiment seems to have been a success, but Yosuke ignores her. He approaches her in a lascivious way and suddenly assaults her.
With that, he grabs the girl's collar and tears the front of her dress wide open. Shock and fear twist the lovely girl's delicate features, stimulating Yosuke's sadism. Even after killing those 2 monsters, the embers of violence still smolder in his heart, and now they have new fuel to burn.
Saya flees into Fuminori's house, but Yosuke manages to catch up to her. He grabs her and wrestles her to the ground.
Her choked voice satisfies Yosuke's lust for conquest. This nightmare has violated him, but now he is able to visit the same torment on this innocent girl. Where he was the victim, he is now the victimizer. The release he feels is intoxicating.
Yosuke then proceeds to rape Saya. Moments later, Fuminori returns home and sees Saya being attacked by a monster.
Rage erupts inside me like black lava. The monster stops gorging itself on Saya's body and turns its head to look at me. Surprised by my own composure, I slip past it and grab the meat cleaver sitting next to the sink. Without a moment's hesitation, I slash at the monster's face. It screams and staggers away from Saya. My attack must have blinded it because it flails its tentacles wildly as it tries to drive me away. My bloodlust still unsated, I calmly seize one of the appendages and plunge my weapon twice more into its quivering flesh. The blade enters its body with fascinating ease. Each strike sprays my face with its blood. As I carve the monster to pieces and savor its hideous screams, my mind is consumed by fury. No mercy. I'll see this monster suffer for what it has done to Saya. I succumb to the fury, growling at the top of my lungs as I slash and slash and slash and slash. Even after the flesh beast stops moving, I keep slashing until I realize that it can no longer feel pain. Cursing myself for killing it so quickly, I stab the cleaver into the floor, snapping it in half.
Once Yosuke is dead, Saya hugs Fuminori and cries, apologizing profusely. Saya explains to Fuminori that this was her fault. She manipulated Yosuke's brain after studying Fuminori's medical files, as well as the DNA from his semen, and managed to inflict upon Yosuke the same condition Fuminori has. Fuminori asks her why she would do such a thing, and Saya says,
I thought that if everyone were like you, humans would be kind to me.
This is a pivotal point in the story. Aside from it serving as definitive proof that Saya is a predator with no concern for human suffering, it also facilitates Fuminori's rationalizations regarding his insecurities. In his mind, he can differentiate himself from Yosuke. Even though it was Saya who altered his mental state and behavior, Yosuke can be framed as a bad man. Yosuke is a rapist. Fuminori is not like Yosuke. Fuminori is kind and gentle to Saya, therefore he is not victimizing her. This distinction between overt and covert abuse is a very common type of justification among abusers, including child molesters. Fuminori's previous moral doubts completely vanish, because he can now reconcile himself as a protector of Saya. He can reframe his self-image from pervert to misunderstood romantic. This is not about societal acceptance, but personal acceptance. Even though he's still Saya's victim, this is how Fuminori views himself. Because of all this, Fuminori doesn't hear what Saya is actually saying and focuses on the part that involves himself. He tries to convince her that he doesn't care what she looks like.
You think that I'm kind to you because of the accident? You're wrong. That was only the beginning. Our relationship is the sum of so much more. The time you and I have spent together, those days, those experiences, are what made us what we are. You've been there for me, Saya, sharing my pain, giving me hope and joy. That's how you became so important to me.
This is the first time Fuminori expresses his emotions in a sincere way. He then kisses her, and it's also the first time that he is actually present during sexual intimacy.
I wrap my arms tightly around her and seal her lips with mine. Saya responds, winding her arms around my neck as our tongues desperately seek each other's warmth. At this moment, Saya is my whole world, and I am hers. The earth turns for us alone.
Fuminori remembers that the previous day Saya told him that he loves him, and that he didn't say it back, but his thoughts are interrupted by Saya, who explains to him that since she can manipulate people's brains, and her experiment with Yosuke was a success, she can cure him by reversing his condition. This is essentially the same crossroads Fuminori faced with Yo. Once again, he is confronted by the fear of commitment, but the stakes are much higher. Yo was merely asking him for his companionship. Saya is asking him to give up his humanity for the sake of love. So far, Fuminori has been in this state because it simply happened to him. He was in an accident, he had the surgery, and now he is this, where his descent to inhumanity could very likely be a symptom of his condition, especially given Yosuke's sudden behavioral changes. But Saya's offer adds a new layer to Fuminori's character. He can decide to stay this way. Saya's offer provides a glimpse into her character as well. Saya is insecure about her own perceived appearance and how it affects Fuminori's emotions. This insecurity of hers was most likely inherited by Fuminori himself. This serves as yet another form of manipulation on her part. Saya could have asked him earlier, but she didn't. It's easier to abandon your humanity once you're halfway there. Fuminori is already complicit in murder and cannibalism. He has very little left to lose. Even if he was cured, how would he explain all the dead people around him to the authorities? And so, Fuminori decides to stay this way.
On that terrible day, when I first opened my eyes after the accident, what would my answer have been? When I think back on this many years from now, will I wish that my answer today had been different? It doesn't matter. Here, at this moment, there is no doubt in my mind.
But of course Fuminori doesn't see his situation as the product of manipulation, nor himself as prey. In his mind, this is the braver choice. Not wanting to be too weak to find happiness, a sentiment Franz Kafka himself directly expressed towards the end of his life. Fuminori has finally found the courage to commit. Giving up his humanity for Saya is the ultimate gesture of love. After such a huge step, Fuminori immediately wants to deflect, and so he turns his attention to Yosuke's dead body, thinking about how difficult it is to feel empathy for him.
He was hardly a stranger. We've been neighbors for as long as I can remember. I'd go so far as to say we were on good terms before the accident, and now I've killed him with my own 2 hands. I feel small. Mr. Suzumi, the kindly painter who lived next door, is but a distant memory. The pieces of meat around me belonged to a creature whose mere existence was nauseating. Only by killing the vermin could I find relief.
This passage perfectly mirrors the Metamorphoses, and the way it describes the satisfaction of killing a pest is eerily relatable. I'm sure many of us have felt pleasure in finally getting rid of an annoying mosquito or cockroach.
My hands are wet with another man's blood, and yet I am utterly calm. Now I know what I lost in the accident. Saya says that I can take it back, but I know that I cannot. It is gone forever, like the life of the man called Suzumi.
And now that he has had a moment to process what happened, Fuminori finally understands that Saya isn't human.
Everything is monstrous and loathsome in my eyes. Everything but Saya. I thought that she was somehow unique. I was wrong. I see her just as I do everything else, as something other than what she really is.
He also understands that the tasty fruits he had been eating was human flesh.
I finally realize that even though the stench of these monsters' flesh turns my stomach, their blood and guts smell pretty good. In fact, I know this fragrance quite well.
Fuminori tells Saya that he loves her, and they embrace.
As Saya wipes away tears flowing from her eyes, I can no longer see any hint of fear in her face. I have sworn my oath, and Saya has accepted it. We have nothing to fear now. Saya will never need to cry again.
After chopping up the dead bodies of the Suzumi family and storing them as food for later, Saya and Fuminori decide to abandon the city and live in a secluded cabin in the woods. Saya, using Omi's phone to impersonate her, lures Yo to the cabin and captures her. Saya rapes Yo and uses her flesh-weaving powers to alter Yo's appearance to resemble her own, so that Yo would look normal to Fuminori, and then she presents Yo as a gift to him. Fuminori's reaction to this is immediately and exclusively lustful.
Tsukuba Yo is curled up on the floor without a scrap of clothing to cover her shivering body. When I first lay eyes upon her naked flesh, I am entranced by the sensuality of her generous proportions, far more mature than I would have expected from her usual pure and innocent appearance.
Once again, we see the same obsession with purity and innocence, juxtaposed with sexual maturity.
This is the Tsukuba Yo I remember, not the putrid creature whose attentions I found so unbearable after the accident. My senses recognize her as the human that she is.
Even when he acknowledges Yo's identity as the woman who was once his friend and perhaps something more, Fuminori doesn't see her as a human being. He objectifies her in the fullest sense of the word, viewing her merely as a receptacle for his sexual desire.
Yo finally notices my presence and turns her head to face me. I see a faint glimmer of recognition in her glassy, unfocused eyes. Her features are exactly as I remember them. Once a twisted creature, unrecognizable as human, Yo is now the very image of human femininity. There is no similarity between what she was and what she is, which can only mean that she has become something utterly inhuman.
What is interesting about this is that a part of Fuminori understands that his reaction is not normal, so he immediately rationalizes it as it being her fault. It's because Yo is different, not because Fuminori is different. The transformation has changed Yo into something inhuman, and that's why he doesn't see her as human. In all other cases, Fuminori had difficulty empathizing with other people because he saw them as inhuman. In the case of Yo, he sees her as human, but still regards her as inhuman. Fuminori has lost all ability to view other humans as people, and the part of himself that feels discomfort in this new reality transposes these negative emotions onto his own self-indulgent ruminations, his insecurities with romantic vulnerability, and as an extension of that, sexual fidelity.
Yo is the first human figure besides Saya that I've seen in the 3 months since the accident, and she's a woman positively glowing with voluptuous feminine beauty. Of course I'm happy, but I also can't ignore the voice of reason that's telling me not to be.
So in Fuminori's mind, his reaction to being presented Yo as a sex slave is not wrong because he is treating another human being as meat, but because his sexual shame manifests once again as this fearful avoidant ambivalence. Just like Franz Kafka had women who loved him and were ready to commit to him, while he was lost in an ocean of childish clinginess and preemptive mourning for the loss of his future independence, so too Fuminori is constantly fighting himself even in his own fantasy. Yo was attracted to Fuminori and wanted him to be her boyfriend. Fuminori's insecurity prevented him from giving a direct answer, and so he paid for it by being cursed with this neurological condition. And then he met Saya, who is sexually insatiable and seems to desire Fuminori unconditionally. It's a childish fantasy born out of insecurity. The perfect woman who gives you everything and expects nothing in return. The perfect woman who is your wife, your sister, your mother, and your daughter, all at the same time. The perfect woman who serves each of those roles depending on your needs at any given time. The perfect woman is not human. But even so, when Saya asked Fuminori the same question Yo did, Fuminori felt the same hesitation. And just like meeting Saya could be interpreted as a fantasy to escape Fuminori's commitment to Yo, this new situation can be interpreted as an escape from his commitment to Saya. Fuminori is pulled even deeper into the fantasy, where now he gets to enjoy both Yo and Saya. He doesn't need to choose, he doesn't need to confront his insecurity, he doesn't need to place himself in emotional vulnerability. He can have everything without risking anything.
I struggle to find the right words to express my true feelings. Men are, well, really depraved creatures, and Yo's body has features that yours doesn't, right? So even though it's nothing like my love for you, I can't help but get aroused.
Fuminori tends to universalize his personal feelings, projecting them onto everyone. In this case, his self-loathing born out of his sexual shame is applied to all men. All men are depraved, therefore I am not responsible for my own desires. I am simply a man who has needs, and these needs must be met. This, of course, is a self-serving rationalization. While it's true that all people have traits, emotions, thoughts, and desires that are irreconcilable with their own self-image or the norms of society, it is generally accepted that we are all still morally accountable for our own behaviors. However, many societal institutions promote ideologies that pathologize not only the behaviors but also the thoughts themselves. In the Abrahamic religions, for example, the desire to commit an act can be just as sinful as the act itself. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. It is not just the act that is immoral, but the desire to act as well. These ideas can very easily produce a culture of shame, and Fuminori is the product of such a culture. He is desperately trying to externalize the source of his shame. It's because he is a man, and all men are depraved. Therefore, it's not his fault. Saya reacts to Fuminori with amusement.
With each word that I squeeze from my lips, Saya's grin grows wider and wider, until finally she starts shaking with laughter. I know, Saya exclaims jovially, patting my shoulder with one hand and wiping tears from her eyes with the other. There's no reason to be ashamed of your natural male instincts.
Again, we see the fantastical nature of Fuminori's relationship with Saya. She repeatedly assuages his guilt, not by asking him to confront it, but by giving him a pass. Fuminori is seeking self-acceptance, but what Saya is giving him is enablement, not acceptance. And that is because Saya is a predator. She has no regard for humans, so of course she would enable Fuminori's increasing sociopathy. She explains to Fuminori that Yo is simply a toy for them to play with.
Saya looks at me with a smile the likes of which I have never seen before. It is calm, so terribly calm, and there is something bewitching about the soft set of her lips that sets it apart from her usual bright, childish expression.
Fuminori interprets Saya's maliciousness by theorizing that the reason she did this to Yo was because she was jealous. Yo was a sexual competitor, and so she wanted to dominate her. This self-centered explanation is yet another extension of Fuminori's fantasy. Everything is about him.
I finally know why Saya chose Yo, for the venom in her voice and smile does not escape me. Although she can no longer answer if asked, Yo would surely have chosen death over this fate. And that is the very reason Saya visited it upon her. How wicked and terrible Saya is. Perhaps others would fear and loathe her. I, however, find her malevolence irresistibly charming.
And here, Fuminori utters what I consider to be the most profound line in the entire story.
The horrifying cruelty of what Saya has done to Yo is so very human. Though her shape may be different, her soul is the same as ours.
In Fuminori's mind, Saya's inhumanity is human. The notion of disregarding a fellow human being's most basic dignity and personhood is a fundamental aspect of the human existence. Humanity itself is cruel. Therefore, to be cruel is to be human. Fuminori's descent into inhumanity is paradoxically making him feel more human, because to him, being human meant wearing a constant mask. This new reality allows him to fulfill his every desire without judgment. Fuminori can finally take off his human mask and reveal the real human underneath. Inhumanity is true humanity.
When I look upon Yo's wretched form, I see the intensity and passion of Saya's love for me, for the flames that have consumed Yo are fueled by that very love.
Franz Kafka was always afraid of the darkness of his own sexuality. He could never fully indulge in it, even in fiction, because his shame always brought him back. In the Metamorphosis, the Samsa family was ashamed of Gregor, and this shame was expressed through the abuse they engaged in against him. Gregor's own shame and self-loathing manifested in his transformation into a monstrous vermin. In Kafka's world, shame turns people into monsters, both literally and figuratively. In the Song of Saya, Urabuchi Gen warns us that the total lack of shame can also turn us into monsters. As Fuminori rids himself of his inhibitions, he soon realizes that there are no limits to his own depravity.
Yo's fearful expression softens a little. Perhaps she remembers me in some part of her mind, and believes even now that I will be kind to her. How foolish. She must not have been sufficiently prepared, as her choke scream is like that of a dying animal. In fact, she reminds me of how Suzumi screamed when I stabbed him with my knife. I can't get this feeling from Saya's tight, slender body, and besides, I would never think of treating her delicate frame so harshly. Having my way with a woman is more fun than I expected. Despite what has been done to her, she is wet. This realization purges my mind of any remaining respect for Tsukuba-yo.
Fuminori and Saya proceed to spend the next few days in the cabin, raping Yo. Fuminori's mind normalizes this new situation almost instantaneously, perceiving himself as the head of a family.
A new home, new food, a new family, all granted to me by Saya. She has selflessly led me from the brink of death to find new joy amid despair, and I too have changed. I have killed 2 people with my own hands, and made a third my mindless slave. Yet despite all that I have done, I am still able to sleep peacefully. Without a doubt, I am no longer the Sakisaka Fuminori I once was. Thanks to Saya, I have a family once again. For the first time, I am becoming aware of the responsibility this places on me. I am now the head of a new Sakisaka household, as well as its only male member. It is my duty to protect, comfort, and ensure the happiness of the women living under my roof.
Meanwhile, Koji, Omi's boyfriend and Fuminori's former best friend, manages to track down the location of the cabin. Upon getting there, he meets Yo, who begs him for help, but Koji sees her as a monster, and so he kills her. He confronts Fuminori and manages to severely wound him, but before finishing him off, Koji is killed by Saya. Once the threat of Koji is gone, Saya informs Fuminori that she is pregnant, and then part of her explodes into countless spores. From Fuminori's perspective, she looks like a blooming flower, her seeds spreading in the wind. Saya's last gift to Fuminori is to transform the entire world into her own image, and then Fuminori would be the only human able to see a monstrous world as normal. The end.
Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses.
What I really love about the Song of Saya is how authentic the writing feels when it comes to the inner workings of the deviant mind and the rationalizations of antisocial behavior, especially in the context of misogyny, mirroring Kafka's writings. The rape scenes are also disturbingly authentic, with the victims described in great detail as dissociating instead of fighting back, as they often do in Hollywood movies. As someone with personal experience in this kind of thing, I hugely appreciate that. I despise this common trope that depicts abuse victims as heroically defiant. Movies often show rape victims as thrashing and fighting back to the very last moment, when in reality most people simply submit, because that's the most common trauma response. Unfortunately, submission is not perceived as cool. Submission is viewed as pathetic. Even today, people still ask rape victims whether they resisted. It's the same type of ignorance that makes people ask why the Holocaust victims didn't fight back. In the overwhelming majority of cases, trauma victims submit to their victimizers. They don't fight back, they just sit there and wait for it to end. This is how abuse is often internalized, and combined with the shame of submission, it can turn into something very nasty. Anyway, I don't want to get too derailed by this, it's just a rare detail that I appreciate whenever I see it in pop culture. Due to the reality of corporate puritanism, another thing I unfortunately cannot adequately convey is how gratuitously sexualizing the writing is. Even scenes that are completely non-sexual contain details that allude to sexual elements, like how Omi fell down and the crotch of her pants got wet from Saya's slime on the floor. Many critics have argued that the Song of Saya's constant sexual gratuity distracts from its story, which is why there exist censored versions that have removed most explicit content from it, but I couldn't possibly disagree more with this position, because I find such critique to be woefully superficial and immensely cowardly. The sexual content in the Song of Saya has a purpose beyond sensuous gratification. It is there to challenge the reader themselves. By reading through the subjective sexualization of abuse, walking the path from coy temptation to shameless indulgence, the reader is confronted with their own emotional reaction to it. It's as if Urobuchi wants you to feel titillated and aroused when reading these horrifying scenes, so that you can confront your own dark thoughts, your own secret desires. It's as if Urobuchi is saying, oh, you find this sexy, you think this rape scene is kinda hot. Maybe you should ask yourself why. It is not a gotcha to pass judgment, but an invitation to explore some of the darker aspects of our humanity. And even if the reader declines this invitation and refuses to engage with it, claiming that none of this is sexy, that in itself is also revealing, and the art has done its job. To me, both the Song of Saya and the Metamorphosis are about existential alienation. Alienation not just from society, family, or friends, but also from your own self. It's the realization that your own body, as a physical instrument, exists outside of yourself. Its needs and desires are dictated to you by it, without your control or consent. Your body wants food, sleep, sex, recognition, respect, and you are but a passenger who can only react with emotions or thoughts. Kafka tended to react to such urges with shame. If we read through his entire body of work, the most prominent emotion he invokes is shame. Urobuchi approaches the same subject with shame as well, but from a different angle. He shows us what happens if we succumb to these needs and desires by letting them control us. In both cases, not reconciling our innermost thoughts with how we see ourselves is what causes us to lose our humanity. And this is why, in writing the Song of Saya, Urobuchi Gen not only wrote a love letter to Franz Kafka, but also had intercourse with his ghost, guiding him through all the things his shame didn't allow him to explore when he was alive. And even though Urobuchi and Kafka approached sexual shame from opposing angles, they both ended up in the same conclusion, because both suppressing and succumbing to our darker thoughts lead us to the same place. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the distinction between thought and act. While progressive societies claim to be against the concept of thought crimes, many people have difficulty separating the two, especially when it comes to subjects of sexual divergence like bestiality or pedophilia, because societal taboos act as thought terminators. Even the very idea of entertaining certain thoughts is reprehensible, so they must be crushed without hesitation. And this social programming is so deeply ingrained that some people who are watching this video right now may be thinking, why is this guy defending pedophilia? He must secretly be a pedophile. This suppression of the existence of our darkest desires, whether it's murder, torture, rape, only makes us vulnerable to being controlled by them. And this is not a figure of speech, it can happen quite literally. Let's say I'm a middle-aged man and I see a young, scantily clad woman walking down the street. Should I acknowledge my attraction to her and my momentary desire to have sex with her? No, of course not. That would make me a creep. I am not a creep. I am an upstanding citizen, a married man. I have a family. I am a well-respected father, and she's young enough to be my daughter. You know what? It's her fault, because she's a slut. How dare she cause me discomfort with her provocative outfit? She should not be allowed to do that. And that's how easy it is to externalize shame. My shame for being attracted to her became her shame for being a slut. Instead of processing my own thoughts and emotions, I projected them onto her, and if I successfully limit her behavior by disallowing her to dress provocatively, then I will never have to deal with my own issues. And because there are others like me, just as reluctant to introspect as me, it will be easy to find support in my attempt to limit this young woman's freedom. Maybe we should have a dress code that prevents young women from dressing provocatively. Because when young women dress provocatively, it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us even more uncomfortable when the young women are minors. And just like that, my personal problem became society's problem. And a society that doesn't promote psychological honesty is highly vulnerable to mass projection, scapegoating, and moral hysteria. And this is just an example, by the way. It's not a feminist issue. This is not a men versus women issue. Everyone has the capacity to do this, and they do it all the time. Everyone has dark thoughts, and whoever denies it is simply lying, either to themselves or to others, because that's how we've been taught to act. Society demands moral behavior, but often makes it impossible to honestly acknowledge the inner forces that challenge it. If entertaining a thought becomes morally equivalent or even comparable to acting upon said thought, then we are cultivating a world where hypocrisy is more valuable social currency than honesty. There can never be sincere self-examination when the collective is rewarding performative morality. It would be easy for me to say that the Song of Saya is disgusting and gross and offensive and indecent and depraved, because that's the nature of intellectual cowardice. It is satisfying to conform, to virtue signal at the in-group while shunning the out-group. Whenever someone brings up this type of subject, I must immediately shut it down to prove that I am not one of them. I am one of the good ones. I am a nice guy. I am not like other girls. I never think about hurting other people. I don't have any dark fantasies. I am a good person. And it's this desire to preserve the image of our ideal self that eventually destroys us. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you on the battlefield.
One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious.